What's up, everybody? Welcome to Real Time for the real everyday movie fan. I'm Ryan Murphy,
And I'm Josh Williams.
I'm James Sheridan.
and today we are bringing you Crazy About the 80s. We're discussing all the rampant 80s nostalgia going on in Hollywood today, which is a really interesting phenomenon. There just seems to be a lot of celebration of this decade. People just seem to be, it's not even just nostalgia. It's some people who didn't even grow up in the 80s are just celebrating it. It seems like this just seems to be a romantic period in time that people like to throw themselves back into, whether they live through it or not. So here to talk about that. Now, of course, we already did do a show. You might be thinking this sounds like a similar premise to our previous show, which was nostalgic sequels. Sequels to movies, sequels to entries in franchises that came out a long time ago, where there's a long interval. And a lot of those were very 80s nostalgic because they were sequels to movies that came out in the 80s, stuff like Cobra Kai, Blade Runner. But even beyond those, there's other things that are really celebrating the decade in the time period that we're living in now. And the ones that we're going to try and go over today include Ready Player One, Guardians of the Galaxy, Stranger Things, It, and The Goldbergs. So we're going to go ahead and talk about that stuff. Let's go ahead and start with Ready Player One. Many of you guys have probably seen the movie, even if you haven't read the book. But for those who are unaware, it takes place in the future. But it's a future that celebrates the 80s really hardcore. Why? It's a long story, basically because there's this guy who is an analog for the author. The author and him were both born in 1972. Were obsessed with 80s culture as a kid. And this guy, for, again, long story, sort of brings the world into an intense era of 80s nostalgia. And the whole book is sort of centered on stuff it's centered on a lot of stuff that came out in a lot of decades, but it's especially focused on the 80s. And
so the basic premise is that he's basically like a mashup between like Steve Jobs and Willy Wonka. And he's at the end of his life, he dies, and he's giving up his entire fortune. And this place called the Oasis that is basically it's basically the internet, but you're like sucked into it in like
the ultimate version
3D.
of virtual reality.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's basically virtual reality. You would own all of this stuff, but in order to win this sort of scavenger hunt, you have to have deep knowledge of all of the things that this man loved. And because he grew up in the 80s, it's a very sort of central, informative era of pop culture that you need to know very deeply in order to win. In order to solve these puzzles, you have to know, war games verbatim. You have to know how to solve modules from Dungeons and Dragons. You have to be able to play Joust flawlessly, kind of thing. And like it's there's an entire culture within the book, and less so in the movie, but it does exist, of people hunting the egg who call themselves Gunters. And the entire Gunter culture is about celebrating and enjoying the 80s.
Well, it's about celebrating a lot of things. Like in the movie, they even have like the Iron Giant and Firefly. But yeah, there is a special focus on the 80s. And this is really interesting because Josh and I were not really children of the 80s. I was born very late 87. Josh,
I was born in 89.
89. So James, you're the oldest of us. You were born in 82. Like I said, Halliday / the author Ernest Cline was born in 72. So he's about 10 years older than you. But for both of you guys, it's interesting to see how this affects us all based on our different ages. But for both of you guys, what were some of the stuff that you responded to as far as stuff that you were also nostalgic for, or even stuff that you were introduced to and educated about?
Well, for me, and like I said, I was born in 89. Now, of course, I grew up like on E.T. and Star Wars. Like a lot of the big time 80s stuff I grew up on as well. Like I had my own Nintendo. Like this movie focuses more on Atari than anything, but it's still like I still have things of the 80s that I grew up with as well, especially in my young childhood. But like the things I kind of related to a lot were as far as in the book itself. I won't reference much. I mean, I guess you can reference some of the movie. It's just they went in a lot more in depth in the book, and that's kind of typical when you talk about a movie adapting a book. So within the book itself, I would say like a lot of things I kind of connected with. There's some of the stuff I grew up, like you said, the Iron Giant was one of the things I really grew up on loving, and I was glad to see they referenced that. Even Gundam Wing, I grew up watching a lot, and like when they had that introduced in there. Mecha Godzilla was another big one that I grew up knowing because of just the Godzilla franchise itself. And there's even some just I actually when I started reading the book, there was one of the things that I really gravitated towards were not necessarily just things I was nostalgic for myself, but the things I was learning, new things I was learning about the '80s I didn't before. Like some of the games that were introduced, like Joust. Like I never knew what that game was, or like a lot of the movies that they're referencing. Uh, like I did, I saw War Games even before I read the book, but I didn't realize that there's such a big part of it. Like there's other movies like when me and you got introduced to Crawl and we watched it because they reference it so much, and we're gonna be watching Lady Hawk soon,
Yeah.
and like some of these other movies that are not necessarily the best ones of the bunch, but or like Monty Python and the Holy Grail. Like I've seen the movie before this, but I had a weirdly enough a much deeper appreciation for it than before that.
Yeah.
So it's just kind of stuff like that, like where I was learning about things the '80s that I didn't know before, that I kind of actually, because when I was a kid, every generation has their, oh, my generation is better than your generation. And so while I still do believe I love the '90s more than the '80s as far as like quality of stuff out there, I still have a much deeper appreciation and love for the '80s than I did when I was younger. I will definitely say that.
Yeah, there's a reason why Atari was a much stronger presence in this, and that's because given the age of Halliday and Ernest Cline, Atari would have been a much more formative era for him because Nintendo wasn't introduced to North America until 1985.
Yep.
And even though it had like the corner of the market it had the market absolutely cornered, Atari was a lot of people's sort of entry into video games. You had arcades, and arcades were fun, but I mean, most kids would go in with like a couple dollars worth of quarters, pump them in, and then lose and go home. Whereas with a home console, you could play that for hours and hours and hours. And one of the very formative games for both the book and the movie was Adventure. And it was sort of the impetus for the story was that within this, the guy who created the game, his name escapes me at the moment.
Warren Robinette.
Yes, thank you. He hid an Easter egg because the guys who made these games, it was a single programmer at the time. He'd spend months working on this game by himself, and they would get no credit for the game. So he hid his name in the game, but you had to find it through this sort of like elaborate series of events. And that is part of what inspired Halliday to create this whole adventure. And at the time that I found the book, I was kind of into reading about these stories because again, I was a little too young when Atari crashed in 1983, and kind of like the entire industry kind of fell apart. So that era of gaming kind of ended, even though like everybody had an Atari at that point. And if you went over to like anybody's house, their older brother had an Atari, and you'd play like Frogger and Dig Dug and Missile Command and Pac-Man, and so like that was kind of ubiquitous. But the idea behind Adventure hiding these kind of concepts in there, and being able to like search the game to the point of finding that stuff, is a big appeal for a lot of gamers and a big appeal to Halliday and Ernest Cline, and sort of again the backbone of where this adventure comes from is that sort of deep exploration, that deep appreciation that you couldn't get in the coin-op games.
I don't know about I agree, and I don't know about you guys, but I miss arcades so much. Like, it's funny, like you don't see them. You see them today for like older people, like Dave and Buster's. Like if it's for like those are for kids, it's mostly for adults. So like in Des Moines in Kansas City, there's a place called Up Down where it's a video game bar. I love those, and they're more for us as people of our generation because we grew up playing arcades. But it's just sad that today's kids won't really. I wouldn't even know if they open up an arcade for kids today, they would even go because of some fact they have games at their fingertips with a tablet or a phone.
I don't know how you play Call of Duty on an arcade.
Yeah, and I don't know, just stuff like that. Like that was such a fun time when I was a kid, and even so this day, like I haven't since now because of the pandemic, but I remember I used to go all the time to those places because it's actually just a fun time.
Well, I mean, go ahead.
Spinning off of that, like part of the complaint about why kids aren't going to appreciate arcades is that, again, they have everything on demand. the same applies for movies and television, where you just load up Netflix and or you load up Amazon or you load up Disney Plus and you've got just about any show you could ever want, you know, at your fingertips. But when we were kids, we didn't have that. We'd have to wait week to week watching TV for the next episode of something. Or my favorite adventure was going to the video store.
Yes.
And how formative that was to my childhood was, you know, the very special Saturday afternoon when it was raining, my parents would take me and I would get to pick out a movie and sit there and watch the movie as a family. And it was like an event. It was a thing that we did, and it was like special. And we had junk food and popcorn and, you know, sodas and just all kinds of great, you know, memories built around that. And that's where a lot of my love for that era comes from is, you know, I love Back to the Future and Ghostbusters and Star Wars and Jaws and E.T. and Indiana Jones because of those experiences. And I feel like that's where the nostalgia for specifically this franchise comes from, is that sort of experience. In fact, I think I'm trying to remember, it's been a long time since I read the book. I think there's an actual point where he goes to an arcade on a planet that's based on what's his name's childhood town.
Yeah, Holidays.
Because,
Holidays
because they don't exist. They don't exist like that anymore. And that, like, there are arcades, but like you said, they're all nostalgia. And like the ones I know about in my city are like bars where you go there and it's all like hipster nerds who go there for, you know, board games and, you know, rolling a D20 to figure out what shot you're going to take. And they're all like themed on like Firefly and, you know, it's just all kinds of different franchises and whatnot. And the experience of actually going to an arcade is a completely lost thing. So is going to a Blockbuster, because they don't exist anymore.
Yeah.
And I think that's why we gravitate towards this stuff more than younger kids will, because it's an experience that you just can't have anymore. But I think that the mystique of that stuff that doesn't exist anymore is part of what makes this sort of a general appeal, is what was it like to go to the video store to pick out your favorite movie rather than, you know, just loading up Netflix.
Well, there is, I think that, I mean, a lot of the kids are the ones that are consuming this now, you know, so they're being introduced into this bygone era that's really romantic for them. And it's beyond the scope of what they're used to. And as far as the 80s, like, it's even beyond my scope, technically speaking, because I grew up in the 90s. But it's just, there's just something about this this era that's it's like, again, there's some like, okay, video stores, those were around in the 90s. I grew up on that, you know. So that's common. Yeah, for me it was Hollywood Video. I remember
Hollywood Video.
There was a the Hollywood Video in Des Moines. Josh, I don't know if you remember the one that used to be down on Euclid. There's a tobacco.
Yeah, I remember it. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a tobacco store there now. But in 1995, when Batman Forever came out, they had a big mural of Batman Forever that never got took down. So as long as that was there was this big thing of Val Kilmer with his cape. But yeah, those are very nostalgic memories, but I think that there's a romance, is what I'm trying to say, for people who have never lived through it, to just sort of learn about that.
Jurassic Park was one of the first movies I ever bought with my own money. I saved up for it because, you know, VHSs weren't exactly cheap at a certain point. I think it was like $25, $30. And for a kid, that's, you know, that's a lot of months, you know, combing the couch for pocket change. But I remember it was a jumbo video here. It's a Canadian chain that you guys wouldn't have, but going there and then picking it up and like pre-ordering the movie, buying it, bringing it home, opening it. And I can still to this day remember the smell of the inside of the box, that plastic smell that's still, whenever I smell that smell with any sort of plastic, I get this sort of like euphoric high of like, oh, that's my childhood. And it just,
that's science. Olfactory is the sense that's most linked to memory. So when you smell something, it's the thing that goes, whoa, oh, man, again.
So I will forever remember like going to pick up that VHS and having that, like, just that experience is just, that is my childhood. And I love that. And that's what pulls me into stuff like this, is the remembering of those things. And again, the stuff that I didn't get to experience because I was too young to experience Atari in its heyday, and I never got to play Adventure or Joust. but I'm aware of them, and understanding the history and the significance to Halliday, to the real world, to video game history is appealing, and it really kind of draws me in, and that's why this adventure really, clicked with me. Is they're experiencing the same things I am, where it's like stuff I didn't get to experience, or stuff that I did experience but have long forgotten, and just playing off of that it's hugely appealing to me.
Well, and the other thing, Josh, is that we talked about the movies that this introduced us to. Now, I personally have still never seen War Games. I know I need to.
Oh, dude, yeah, it's great.
But when we talk, and the three of us have been talking on Facebook a lot about 80s fantasy and how 80s fantasy kind of sucks. And so even the movies he references in this are not really fantasy, they're mostly sci-fi. And the one time he does sort of make a reference to fantasy is talking all about Lady Hawk and how much, they're debating whether Halliday likes it or not. And he says, he had it in his collection. Yeah, well, he had Howard the Duck and Krull too. So I said, let's watch Krull, because that's a movie that's been referenced just once in the book. But so we watched Krull, and it was so bad that it's one of our favorite memories together.
Oh my God. I remember it was only like 10, 15 minutes in to the movie, and we're both looking at each other like, what the is going on right now? What? I don't understand what is happening.
Yeah. But we talked about how 80s was not a very good time. It was a great time for sci-fi. You had the Star Wars sequels both came out. Back to the Future, RoboCop, Terminator. I mean, brilliant 80s sci-fi. There's actually a documentary coming out. There's a documentary coming out called In Search of Tomorrow, which it's a documentary all about 80s sci-fi movies. And if you go online and you look up the trailer, it has about 100 clips from 100 movies. And then they list the movies at the end of the trailer, like everything you just saw. And it's more than we can reference here. So it was a brilliant time for sci-fi. Not such a great time for fantasy. We talked about, we could name like 10 movies that came out in that era. One of which is Krull, another which was Willow, which I just watched for the first time and was really disappointed in, because it was Lucas, it was Ron Howard, and it just blew. And I
would say Highlander's fantasy.
Highlander, and then the other big one. It's not referenced ever in Ready Player One, which is really interesting, but it's a huge classic. It's Never Ending Story, which it's like the biggest traumatic thing in my entire childhood as far as entertainment, like stuff that scared the shit out of you as a kid. That's The King. I mean, I will never get over oh my God, the freaking horse in this quicksand.
The existential crisis of going through the swamp of sadness is just...
Yeah,
no 10-year-old should experience that. That's
pretty traumatizing.
I mean, Never Ending Story, I love that one. And, I'm going to throw a few other ones that are arguably fantasy that I do think hold up. Dark Crystal and Labyrinth being two of them.
Yeah.
And maybe that's because I like Henson and a lot of the stuff he does, but I think they're both really well done films. And of course, you can't go wrong with David Bowie. You just can't.
No.
I'm not a big fan of him, but I admit that he is unique and iconic, and his segments in that film just live on past time.
Mm-hmm. What I appreciated the most about Ready Player One is they did focus a lot on science fiction, but they also reference a wide variety of films within the 80s, like not just science fiction and fantasy, but like things like Ferris Bueller's Day Off, 16 Candles. I mean, what other ones that comedy Airplane was another one. Goonies was another good one that they referenced. Risky Business was in there at one point. Just the ones like that, I think I was glad that they didn't just focus on one genre. It was definitely a love story, not just to the 80s film industry, but just as the 80s in general. They kind of did a good job of keeping it broad.
And it's not just that kind of culture either. Like it's references to things like Pop Rocks and Rubik's Cubes, which are not necessarily media themselves, but I mean, you go back to the 80s, Rubik's Cubes were ubiquitous. Like everybody had one. Everyone did. And it was, a huge thing to try and solve one. And, there's worldwide competitions now for it. And, people trying to solve them in a matter of seconds, which blows my mind. But just little things like that peppered in there that just kind of tell you that, this is actually from that era and not just someone pulling a Big Bang Theory and just looking up on Wikipedia a list of names and throwing them out there.
Yeah.
This is someone who actually lived through that experience.
Mhm. Well, there's also and as we record this, I think every show we do, we should just talk about Ready Player One, because we kind of have been already. But we're
gonna have to do a review of Ready Player 2 when it comes out.
Oh my God, I'm excited.
Oh yeah, we should. As that's what I was just going to reference, is that Ready Player 2 is coming out on Thanksgiving Day, and
oh yeah, you guys haven't had your Thanksgiving yet.
No, we're American.
The real Thanksgiving is coming up soon, James.
Canadian Thanksgiving came first. Thank you very much.
But yeah, it is coming out on Thanksgiving Day because it is an American book for an American audience. We should do a review of it. I don't know how long it's going to take all of us to get through it, because we're all going to get the audiobook probably day one. And
I'm going to probably just listen to the whole thing.
I don't know. I mean, it's going to be a lot of walking. I'm going to get my exercise because I'm going to be walking around, town as we listen to it. That would be a great show. We should all come in and review Ready Player One or Ready Player Two. I'm not sure how the premise came out. They announced the sort of synopsis, and it's just like Wade finds another maze or something, and I don't know what I was expecting, but it doesn't sound too promising. It's just sort of, it might come off as a little flat compared to the bigger journey that he went on in the first film. I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah, I'm skeptical that it's actually going to be any good, because the first one's premise is kind of a standalone thing, and even Ernest Cline's follow-up book Armada wasn't quite the same thing.
Well, that's what I was going to say. Has anyone read Armada? Because I started it and I never finished it.
I haven't.
I've read that a couple times, and I mean, it's fun. It's certainly, he's trying really hard for it to be The Last Starfighter. But it's not Ready Player One, and I don't expect Ready Player Two to be. That said, I'm hyped AF for it, and I'm going to, consume it in a day if I can, because it wouldn't be the first book I've read overnight. You try reading the last Harry Potter book in 8 hours.
Again, we're talking about audiobooks here too, so I mean.
Yeah, but it's I'm excited for it, so it'll be fun to review that one.
Okay, so next up would be Guardians of the Galaxy, and again, this is something that celebrates the 80s because it's an analog for the creator. James Gunn was born in 1966, which is why Guardians of the Galaxy doesn't just celebrate 80s, it really also celebrates the 70s in terms of music, and that's something we didn't even bring up before with Ready Player One, is the music of the era. It's
hard to comment on music in a book when it's just kind of referenced and passed along. The music was much bigger in the movie for Ready Player One, but it's like spread throughout Guardians, both films. Like, people were clamoring for the soundtrack because these are just bangers of songs, an absolutely iconic soundtrack.
Well, and the songs fit so well in the movie too. I mean, it was just great, especially the first movie. The second movie, maybe not so much. The second movie kind of struggled in that because they really captured lightning in a bottle with all just every time a song hits in the first movie, it's just magic. Again,
are you saying that you don't enjoy Baby Groot dancing around to Electric Light Orchestra?
That was great. There was a couple really nice moments in the second movie, but the first movie was really throughout the whole movie. I mean, literally from the opening dance to Come and Get Your Love to Ooh Child, when they're laying around when they just after the big bomb explodes or whatever. Just the whole movie is just, and those are both examples of 70s songs too. So it's not just the 80s. But the character of Star-Lord, unlike James Gunn, is born in 1980. So he's a little bit, he's much younger, obviously. He celebrates the 70s music because his mother introduced him to it.
But one of the big references to the 80s that's used throughout the entire film is the Walkman, which wasn't introduced until the 80s. So that's kind of the big factor there.
Yeah, with the whole premise being, what if someone was taken off Earth in the 1980s and 80s culture is basically as late as they know anything? And that was a really interesting premise that James Gunn came up with in that respect, and it led to a lot of great references. And there's a really funny video if you guys watch.
Which is wholly unique to the films too. That's not something that's part of Star-Lord's character in the comics as much.
Oh, nothing.
Because I believe he's more modern day adult than I don't. I'm trying to remember if he was actually on Earth much at all.
Well, the movie is totally like its own creation. I mean, it's really hardly based, especially with the character of Star-Lord, on the comics at all. I mean, they really go. James Gunn really was able to take it in his own direction.
Definitely. Yeah. And like, it isn't just the music they reference. I mean, even the character of Star-Lord kind of references like things like Kevin Bacon to Gamora. Yeah, Footloose. And, just certain stuff like that that's still sprinkled throughout, not just the movie. It's the stuff that he knew before he actually was taken off Earth.
And it's brilliant. I mean, it's really brilliant how even all the way through Infinity War, the characters think that Kevin Bacon is like an action hero.
Yeah, is Footloose still the greatest movie of all time? It never was.
But yeah, if you guys ever watch How It Should Have Ended, I used to be a big fan. I haven't watched it in a long time, but there's an episode where he comes back to Earth, and Star-Lord comes back to Earth, and he's listening to modern day music, and he's like, "You guys sing a lot about butts now."
It's a true statement.
I do imagine him after Endgame going to like a Radio Shack and picking up as many cassettes as he possibly can and a new vintage cassette deck to put into his ship, because I'm pretty sure the last one got destroyed.
Well, that'll be the interesting thing, is that that was one of the criticisms against Endgame, was that it shows him on Earth, which is a big deal for that character, but it blows past it. And so I'm hoping the next time we see him, I think the next time we'll see him is in Thor: Love and Thunder, and then in Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, that we're maybe treated to some flashbacks to that and to see what happens in those moments.
That would be nice, because once he finally comes back to the world, he is on Earth. He attends Robert Downey Jr.'s funeral. I think they were just trying to keep with that somber tone moving towards the ending, which would be nice if we are moving into, maybe I would like to see if like Guardians 3 starts off like right as it left off, like they're still on Earth, haven't quite left yet. And they kind of like do some of those things, and they do maybe even some flashbacks just for fun, nostalgia purposes. Because I would love to see Star-Lord just kind of hanging around Earth, like, whoa, things are really different than what I remember.
They still love Ninja Turtles, though.
What's that?
I said they still love Ninja Turtles, though. That never went away.
That's true. So other than that, I mean, that's the one. Like, Guardians did a pretty good job as trying to be as nostalgic as possible. There's only so much you could do, because if I remember right, he was kind of taken like in 1987, 86 as a child.
Somewhere around there.
1988,
88, okay, yeah. So around that time, it was, the 80s was kind of winding down a little bit. Like not winding down, but you know what I mean? Like the things that were more references. But you know what I mean? Like the things, a lot of things that he knew were already kind of the big aspects of it. So there's only so much you can kind of reference when trying to stay focused on a story.
It's also really weird that his mom let him watch a lot of these movies. Like, sometimes he's just like you were only 8 years old, or when that movie came out, or something. It's like,
oh, you didn't live in that era, dude. Yeah, all the kids watched. Like, I remember when I was 5 years old, everyone I knew had seen all the Freddy Krueger movies.
That's crazy.
And we would play Freddy Krueger in the playground kind of thing. So like,
my mom was pretty strict about that. My mom was, we didn't watch that.
But I mean, you grew up on Terminator 2, which was...
No, I didn't grow up on it. I watched Terminator 2 for the first time when I was 14 years old. So
Oh, wow, really?
Well,
yeah, I watched it when I was 8.
When it came out, it was big with kids. So like, it wasn't unusual for kids to watch rated R movies at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because when a little peek behind the curtain there, because when I was a kid, I mean, I discovered by myself. I discovered Cinemax, and Cinemax at
let's
after midnight Cinemax. So, but I'm just saying, like,
this is not your psychology appointment.
I'm just saying, like, back in those days, it was very easy for kids to kind of just introduce themselves into things that their parents probably had no clue.
Well, from what I've heard is that there was a big thing where parents mistook RoboCop for a kids movie and took their kids by mistake. Like, well, let's go take kids. Yeah.
It doesn't help that RoboCop wasn't marketed as a kids movie, but there were toys and a cartoon series and all of this other stuff kind of surrounding it that were very specifically aimed at kids.
Yep.
For a rated R movie.
Yeah, terrible rated. Like there's a point where a guy literally just about melts and then like is blown apart by a car, like hitting him.
Well, not just
Like
that, but the scene where he gets pretty much shot up to
right,
all
yeah.
hell. That's a
Mhm.
good introduction there.
So yeah.
But I mean, this is also the era where we grew up with, Nazis melting at the end of
Mhm.
Indiana Jones and Raiders of the Lost Ark. So it's like kids were kind of used to seeing that kind of thing.
Well, this,
Um,
yeah,
it,
yeah.
it wasn't unusual.
But what the reason I said, well, the reason I wanted to talk about that is, how kids back in those days, especially the 80s and 90s, kids get a lot of things that their parents had no clue about. This kind of segues into our next section that we're talking about, which is Stranger Things.
Oh,
Whereas,
Stranger Things.
yeah, but that's like
Y'all up.
for me, out of all these things we're talking about, this is what really started off the 80s craze of nostalgia. And like the reason and like things that a lot of those kids did and watched during the whole show, their parents had no clue. And that's how it was for me, even when I grew up as a kid. Like when I grew up as a kid, you left the house after breakfast, you didn't come back till after sunup, and your parents just they went out you out and played with your friends, and you went and got into all kinds of weird shenanigans, weird and fun shenanigans. Like I remember as a kid, we built a ramp that was way too high for any kid to play, and we had like our bikes, and like we must have fallen multiple times with bruises and scrapes, but we just kind of just kept
Oh,
playing.
there was no parental supervision in the 80s. Like
No,
nothing.
not at
The
all.
stuff we got into was insane.
Well, I mean I first of all, Josh and I grew up very much in the 90s, so it wasn't, I don't think it's that different. I don't know how it's different from now, other than the fact that kids have cell phones and their parents, keep track of them in that way.
No, but I
Well,
mean, like Stranger Things, like the kids are riding, like, and a lot of '80s movies, the kids are just off on adventures by themselves, and you
mhm.
wouldn't get that nowadays. Like that doesn't really exist these days with the way it did when I was a kid, where you just hop on your bike and disappear in the neighborhood for a day,
Yeah,
and then come home and it was dinner time or before it got dark. Like parents had no idea where their kids were. There's no cell phones to track them. There's no,
yeah, exactly.
find my iPhone. It's just you disappeared for the day because that's what you did as a kid. Like we disappear into the woods for hours.
Like one of the great examples is like in season 3 of Stranger Things, where one of the Dustin wants to go try and find his friends, and he asks Mike's parents like, where's your son at? The father's like, hey, where's Mike? She goes, oh, I think he's over at Will's. But really, he's not. Or like,
Yeah.
just like things like that like happened a lot back in those days, and that's kind of what like in the season 3 opener of Stranger Things, the kids sneak into Day of the Dead, which is a rated R film. So the stuff like that is what I was kind of referencing too. But I mean, if you guys, that's what I kind of wanted to talk really about Stranger Things for you guys. Like, do you guys agree with me that it kind of started off like season 1 of Stranger Things kind of for me really started off this craze of 80s nostalgia?
Well, I want to talk about that, especially because here's the really interesting thing about Stranger Things. When I was bringing this up before, I was talking to my dad, who's like, well, obviously, if there's a big 80s craze, it's because the people who are making it are nostalgic for their own childhood. But that's not the case with Stranger Things. The creators of Stranger Things were born in 1984. They were 6 years old when the decade ended. The characters in Stranger Things are not analogs for their childhood. I mean, they're
Yep.
much older than them. So they really just created this, not out of their own childhood, but just out of objective 80s appreciation as a younger person.
But something you have to understand about that era, because I'm the same way, is that you grow up on the stuff that came before. You don't grow up necessarily with the stuff that comes concurrent, especially in the 80s where, it might be a year or two before you see something on home video. So like if you missed Back to the Future in theaters, you wouldn't see it until, 86 or 87 if your parents rented it kind of thing. But, Star Wars was all over the place, and, Indiana Jones kind of thing, and like especially with Stranger Things, there's a lot of reference to like Jaws and The Thing and the Blob and all Alien and that kind of thing, where there's it's sort of an older 80s thing, and I don't think it would make much sense to have the kids sort of late 80s
Mm-hmm.
and enjoying these things. They want them to be sort of concurrent to when these things were relevant. Which is one of my favorite things about 3 is that they go to the theater and they sneak into Back to the Future, which I'm
No,
completely jealous about because, sorry?
no, sorry, they snuck in the opener. They snuck in a Day of the Dead. They're actually running from the Russians in season 3, and they happen to just stroll into Back to the Future, and they have them like sit there
Yeah,
and
but
hide.
I love that they live in a time period where
True.
they can dress up as Ghostbusters for Halloween because it was like the recent sort of pop culture movie, or they can sneak into Back to the Future because it's of that era and it's of that period. Whereas if they had to set that in the late 80s, referencing this stuff, they'd be watching it at home, but they wouldn't be able to sneak into the theater kind of thing or see the posters for it up in the theater. So I think it being set a bit earlier than the Duffers grew up, or a bit earlier than when I grew up, is kind of important to the world building for this series.
One of the other things that I think I liked the fact that with this show that they don't just reference 80s stuff, but they base a lot of their tropes and a lot of their storyline aspects on 80s films. Like it's kind of like a love letter also to 80s films as far as like the tropes and setups that they used for it. And
well,
themes,
a lot of the shots are taken directly from movies, like even the 70s,
or the dialogue or character creation.
Yeah, that where even there's
like the entire first day with Mike and 11 is entirely Elliot and E.T.
Yeah, but there's also there's a point where he's Hopper. Hopper is is similar to Chief Brody in a lot of ways, and there's a point where he's actually just typing in the very first episode kidnapping into the typewriter, and it's just taken directly from the shot in Jaws where he typed shark attack. And there's just tons of references like that.
Not just that,
people calling him Chief and him driving the truck that looks very similar, and being the cop from a small town kind of thing, or like he's from a big city but he moves to a small town. Like his character is built entirely from a prototype of like a mishmash of like him being called Hopper, but being similar to Hooper from Jaws, and sort of being curmudgeonly like Quint was, and like he's sort of an amalgam of all three of the main characters from Jaws. And built sort of from the ground up in that sort of archetype. But
he even literally says in one episode, "I can do anything. I'm the chief of police."
And there's of course the episode where he grabs his hat like Indiana Jones.
Yeah.
And the third season, he's trying way too hard to be Magnum PI.
Oh yeah. Especially the mustache. I mean, come on, man. But I remember when Stranger Things first came out, me and Ryan were like just all about the show. Especially season 2, like when we reviewed it, that was a really fun episode we did on this channel, was reviewing Stranger Things season 2. And so I'm sad to see that there's only going to be about 2 seasons left of this show. But what are the other I can't remember. What are some references that they made that are really like 80s? I know Dungeon, like I have no evidence to back this up, but I know that I feel that Dungeons and Dragons has become very mainstream because of Stranger Things.
It has now, but you have to remember that at the time it was becoming very, I don't want to say mainstream, but it was at least making headlines at that time period because of certain cultural panics. At the time there was a lot of stranger danger panic, and there was a lot of satanic panic where people were worried about cults of Satanists, sacrificing people. Dungeons and Dragons was making national news because of fears that people were going into, sewers and enacting scenes and, doing cult sacrifices, and
there's an episode
losing
of,
their mind and committing suicide because of Dungeons and Dragons. So it's always sort of, especially at that time, it was very much in the sort of cultural zeitgeist. Sort of in a negative way, but I mean, even in like E.T., you see the kids playing it during like the opening scenes and whatnot, where the older teenagers are sitting down to play it, and it's just there. It just exists as part of the world. But I love that within the world of Stranger Things, it's not just a thing that they're playing. It becomes an important sort of backbone and reference for these monsters. They call the Mind Flayer that because of
Demogorgon.
And the Demogorgon, and they make references to the woods. I can't remember what they call it, but based on the Hobbits.
Mirkwood.
Yeah, so
Mirkwood.
they're pulling little things in there, but there's also, like we said, the sort of undercurrents of references to stuff like Chief being very much a prototype of the character, an archetype of the characters from Jaws, but also like the Demogorgon being very clearly a design, stolen from the page of H.R. Geiger, and sort of the xenomorph alien kind of spindly, spiny body kind of thing, and the Mind Flayer being very much sort of the blob kind of creature, and there being a lot of sort of like this thing is kind of ubiquitous throughout it, and there's all kinds of like undercurrent of that stuff driving the plot, and like we said, like 11 at times being a mixture of Carrie or Firestarter, but definitely a lot more E.T. because of her relationship with Mike, and there's even the point where they're riding the bikes and she makes the truck just flip over them, which is sort of like E.T. doing is we're going to fly the bikes over this chasm kind of thing.
Yeah, imagine if Elliot wanted to kiss E.T. It's a little bit.
Yeah, what were you?
If E.T. was a 11-year-old girl and you're an 11-year-old boy, then you might want to. I don't know.
But that's interesting because I did see an episode of Young Sheldon, which is another show that takes place in the 80s, and that's just again that's they set that in the 80s just because that's when that character was a child. So, but I did see an episode where he's playing Dungeons and Dragons, and his mom, who's very Christian conservative, realizes that some of the player things are based on the devil, and she gets real concerned about it, and other people ridicule her for being so concerned about it, and so that's reflected in that show. Is that in that show as well? I haven't seen a lot of Young Sheldon, but that happens to be one episode that I did catch. So
yeah, and I even love some of the, like in season 2, I loved the one episode I really love is when they all dress up as Ghostbusters, but then when they all get there, they're like, I'm Venkman. No, I'm supposed to be Venkman. Why should I be innocent? What, because I'm black? Like it's that little dynamic was fun to see in that whole episode.
I don't know if you guys remember the build up to season 2, but like season 1 blew my mind. I saw the posters everywhere. Yeah. I was hyped and excited for it because it looked like it was going to be a horror film based off of sort of an It, Stand By Me kind of, kids on bikes kind of,
Goonies
having an adventure kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The second one, the very first image they released was the 4 kids in the jumpsuits, in the Ghostbusters jumpsuits. And from that picture, I'm like, this show was designed for me and me alone because I am so about this. And like the first trailer, you see them turn around and like very Ghostbusters-esque kind of poses, and then they get to the montage in that episode, and they actually have the song in there, and I lost my mind. Like my friend and I were watching it together, and she's cackling because I'm just like not quite screaming, but like I'm like wide-eyed and shaking. So I'm so excited for this scene because
what was really
put the music in there.
What was really good about season 2, and Ryan, I'd like you to chime in here, is like I loved the various different themes and moods throughout the whole. Like the first one's pretty much a murder, like a mystery, a sci-fi mystery, whereas this one, like you had a lot of sci-fi mystery, you had a lot of horror, you had a lot of comedy, a lot of buddy comedy, but then at the end is based on a lot of the 80s. They had a tip of the hat to 80s romances with the snowball, and I remember Ryan like lost his mind over the snowball scene, which was such a great scene.
It's a great scene. It's just it's a fantastic scene where all the character arcs sort of come to a close, and sort of the way they wrap it up. It's not just, and you guys know I'm a sucker for romance and stuff like that. And this is romance between 13-year-olds, so it's a little different.
But yeah.
But there's even just the scene of Dustin and Nancy, and like how because he's the one character without a romance. It's just a great scene. It brings everything together. It's such a great close, and I'm a sucker for great denouements. We're getting into review of
it does harken back to a very common thing in the 80s, and it kind of spilled into the 90s of having sort of teen culture. Almost all the movies ended up in some way or another at a dance, or starting at a dance, or involving a dance at some point. So them throwing in the dance at the end of this was just perfect 80s sort of.
Yep, exactly.
Like that's formative for teenage romance when you're in that era. I'm sure it still is now. I don't know. I'm not a teenager.
So
I don't go to teenage dances. So
really, we do all the time. I mean, it helps that I still look like I'm 17. So I mean,
well, you guys also teach. So
yeah, but anyway, so what? I think that pretty much well wraps it up for Stranger Things 90s. I think definitely it was one of the ones that set off the 80s craze, and then everything kind of piggybacked off that because I think Stranger Things came out first, and then Ready Player One came out after.
Well, Ready Player One came out in 2011, so Ready Player One, the book, is actually kind of old at this point. It's 9 years
But it didn't
old.
really pick up steam until sort of around the time the movie got announced.
That's true.
And then the movie itself did, had, like we said, the soundtrack to it, and it's much more visual representation of the 80s. The movie wasn't super popular. It's still more of a kind of a cult thing. But yeah,
it got some pretty good reviews. Like, I think it was certified on Rotten Tomatoes as like 73 or something, which I thought it was much lower than that. But
well, the next thing would be it, which is, again, it's set in the 80s because it kind of has to be, because the original book was published in the 80s and took place, the childhoods of the characters took place in the 50s, so they just sort of bumped up the time period, so it happened to be in the 80s. And again, there's all these sort of fun references to the 80s in terms of music, and in terms of, like, I think there's where the guy has a Menudo poster on his wall or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But
I would say the 80s, the It movie itself, it kind of didn't throw the 80s nostalgia in your face, kind of like Ready Player One or Stranger Things. It's kind of just more set itself, and it was more nuanced in just letting it be what it was. I think what it really did, especially the new movie, I don't necessarily want to talk about the TV film. I want to talk about more like the new movie that came out. That one kind of paid more of the homage to 80s as far as how the movie was shot, how the movie was essentially, made, is kind of like that was its own way of being 80s nostalgia too. It was more based on the filmmaking itself rather than having the in-your-face references, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
James?
I mean, I liked it. I thought it was great, sort of very well done horror. The first one was. I didn't care for the second one as much, which is a bummer because it's a two-part story, and like, it's not a complete story without the second part, but they kind of dropped the ball in the second part. But I don't feel like the 80s was necessarily a necessity of the story, whereas like Stranger Things is built culturally around the 80s and sort of like referentially towards the 80s. And Ready Player One is very much about the 80s and a love letter to the 80s. This is just a period piece. And any reference to the 80s is just a matter of fact happenstance of it being in that era, so that the people would grow up and be, late 30s, early 40s something adults in the now kind of era, so that they can cast people like Bill Hader and whatnot.
Yeah, the only thing I think they were actually referenced in the 80s that was 80s, like, in-your-face reference was the New Kids on the Block that the kid was listening to.
That was what I was thinking about, yeah. It wasn't Menudo, it was New Kids on the Block. But
yeah.
Which was ubiquitous in the 80s. Like, you couldn't escape New Kids on the Block in the late 80s. Like, it was everywhere. Like, we learned it in music class.
Oh, my God.
I'm not joking. Like, we actually did dances to it. Our teacher made us do dances to New Kids on the Block. So it being in it is, I think that's just part of the world building of it, just happens to be in that era as opposed to the creators having a sort of nostalgic love for it.
And
that's my take on it.
Yeah, and the only last theme I think we could talk about here is that is the same through line theme of in Stranger Things as well, and what we grew up with is that the kids went off and did their own thing, and the parents never knew where the hell they were. Like they went, so many different things, went to so many different places, but the parents never really had the, where are they? They just kind of went off and did their own thing, which is kind of the through line for how the 80s was and the 90s.
But I mean, Stranger Things was based heavily on, like they were influenced big time by Spielberg and Stephen King.
Stephen King, yeah.
So like Stand By Me and It were both big influences on the adventures of the kids, and so was E.T. Because that was part of what the 80s was just kids hopping on their bikes and disappearing for the day and just doing their own thing, because that's what you did.
And even the Duffer Brothers talk about how much, we're going back to Stranger Things now, but how much creative freedom that gives them, because you couldn't make that show take place in modern day because the kids would be tracked. So today's
day and age would be like, hey, where's my kid? Well, they have their cell phone. Let's put the GPS on. Oh, there they are.
Turn to find my iPhone and I'll know where kid is.
Yeah.
Movie over. Credits.
So yeah, what's left is I mentioned Young Sheldon. We didn't bring out that before, but I haven't seen much of it. But the other big one is the Goldbergs, and I think that is again very much just something made by a person who grew up in the '80s, and it's based on his life.
Yeah, the impetus for the Goldbergs is that it's from this guy's perspective, and I actually love the premise of this show because it takes huge kind of liberties with the timeline of the '80s because it's about this guy's memory of the '80s. So, for instance, like he'll be talking one week about watching Ghostbusters at home with his grandfather, and then the next week he's going to go and see The Empire Strikes Back in theaters. Which of course doesn't match the actual timeline of the events of the '80s. If anyone knows, Empire came out in 1980, Ghostbusters came out in 1984. There's no way he would be watching it at home before going to see it in theaters. But because it's his memory of things, there's sort of a rosy nostalgia to things. He's looking through it through rose-colored glasses, and it's more about like his crazy zany family set in this era, just filled with stuff from the '80s, and like not just like, you know, he's talking about Ghostbusters and Back to the Future and Transformers and He-Man and Star Wars and going to see The Exorcist in theaters even though he's not supposed to. And there's like, you know, it's very much about the Philadelphia Phillies and Flyers in the '80s who were big teams at that time, and you know the shared experiences with his dad at that period of time, and like his mom doing jazzercise and being all over these weird fad diets and having like the ridiculous like the jumpsuits that she wears and the sweaters. Like it's a little more sort of referential and not sort of like deep as Stranger Things, but it's still a really fun sort of celebration of the '80s by someone who lived in the era through his sort of like lens of, I love this period of time. I love my stupid, quirky, annoying, frustrating family in this time period because it was sort of the formative years of my life. And these zany adventures that we went on. Like, and one of the great things I love about Goldberg's is that because this is based on sort of his nostalgia of the era and his memory of his family, every episode ends with a framing device of he takes footage that he actually shot because he had a camera and he was recording everything in his childhood, much to the annoyance of his siblings and his parents. They would juxtapose the actual events and the scene within the show, showing the side by side, sort of like the dad yelling at him or him doing something stupid or him reenacting something, and like the inspiration for every episode of the show. So I don't know, I just love the Goldbergs because it's that sort of nostalgic, like it leans into the nostalgia and the warm sort of fuzziness of that being his childhood, as opposed to it just being sort of a cold or sort of like factual reenactment of that era. It's more about, you know, the vague sort of memory of that time period. And I love that sort of framing of it as a concept for the show. Like he opens every episode by saying it was December 1980 something, like literally saying 80 something because he doesn't remember what year it was. So it's if you enjoy that period at all and you grew up in that period at all, I highly recommend the show because you're going to love the references, and like the antics of the family are hilarious, and they're just like these broad, ridiculous characters because that's how he remembers his family being. Like his dad is just ridiculous, his brother's ridiculous, his grandfather's his best friend because his grandfather's awesome, and just kind of like yes ands everything this kid does, and it's a fun show.
Well, I think you hit on an interesting point there. Is like you should watch this if you grew up in this era. But I think that's really, I think the premise of this whole show we're doing is how the '80s are becoming so reflected on, and they're being reflected on for a young audience. Again, Josh and I didn't really grow up in that era. Neither did a lot of the kids who are preteens or teenagers that are watching the show, and yet they're being introduced to this stuff. And there's just something about the '80s. Like we said, Stranger Things is maybe the best example of this because it's being made by people who didn't grow up in that era. There's just something romantic about it, and I'm not sure what it is, if it's just the bright colors or the fact that that's when video games started to be a thing, or that's when Saturday morning cartoons really became like, you know, really, well, there were Saturday morning cartoons, there was Hanna-Barbera certainly before that, but
the
more
heyday of the
serious
Saturday
things.
morning cartoon was the 80s. Like that's when they started making shows specifically for Saturday mornings, and
Mm-hmm.
specifically like sectioning off blocks of content to target kids for the 80s, and making, you know, branded cereals for the 80s, and not just it being Corn Pops and Frosted Flakes. It's like you've got Mr. T cereal and Star Wars cereal, and you've got Pac-Man cereal, and you've got Ninja Turtle cereal, and like that era was it was the kid era. It's when kids became the zeitgeist for pop culture, and when pop culture became fascinated with entertaining kids. And I think that's part of where the nostalgia comes from for our generation and after, is that because it was so focused on kids, and because we have such a warm sort of memory of it, it's very different from the 70s or 80s or 70s or 60s or even before that, when, you know, culture sort of started to skew more towards the adult.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas like as we go further and further along, it skews closer and closer to kids, to the point where, you know, the 90s, you had entire channels devoted to kids. You had you know, Cartoon Network, and like Nickelodeon came out in the 80s, but its heyday was in the 90s. And
Mm-hmm.
like they actually had to pass laws about how you advertise to kids, because it was such a wild west in the 80s about how they kind of like targeted kids for selling things, and like entire series of cartoons were made to sell toys.
Yep.
That was their entire purpose. So I'm not surprised that nostalgia for that era, and like, I mean, the movies of that era are just amazing.
It's great.
Like,
great. It was a great
maybe
time.
I'm biased because I grew up in that period, but like, how can you not love Back to the Future and Star Wars and Indiana Jones and like Blade Runner and E.T. and
Mm-hmm.
Jaws? Like, they're just great
Literally
films.
half the movies you just said were directed by Steven Spielberg. You know?
I mean, to be fair, he did carry my childhood almost
16 Candles, The Breakfast Club.
John Hughes movies, you know. Again, that's going into creating things for an adolescent audience. You know, that there was, I think, maybe more of an impetus on creating things for teenagers in that sense than there ever was before. And even some of those movies, like American Graffiti, was the 70s, but that, you know, yeah, so that doesn't count. But still, there was it's a great focus on the youth. And
on the other flip side of that, though, one of the couple of things I wanted to reference here that were modern TV shows, or sorry, TV shows and movies that reference the 80s that I think are important to recognize as well. Because when you think of the 80s, yes, you think of the neon lights, the Nintendo, Atari, these movies that we were referencing. But one of the two things yeah, exactly. But one of the things I really loved ever watching, and I think is a good thing to bring up, is a movie called American Psycho, which was based in the 80s. It starred Christian Bale, where it's just this guy from Wall Street who goes crazy and murders people. But it's definitely set in the 80s because he references, like, he listens to Huey Lewis in the News, and he has like a brick cell phone that's definitely set back in the 80s. And just like a lot of the things that are still referenced that were only in the 80s. Mm-hmm. Or even Hot Tub Time Machine is another one that's definitely based in the 80s. That was a lot of fun to reference. And one of the big ones I definitely want to highlight, because it's not the flashing, it's the under dark side of the 80s, which was the TV show Chernobyl, which if you have not seen that, highly recommend, because it really sheds light on what all went wrong during Chernobyl in Russia. So that's another one that, even though it wasn't in America, it's still set in the 80s. And they even reference a lot of the American news shows that were covering it during that time as well.
Well,
it was a huge event. Like, you didn't have to be Russian to know that Chernobyl was a thing. Like, Chernobyl was a disaster, and Chernobyl was a historic event that kind of fed into the zeitgeist about nuclear power and the dangers of communism and all of these sort of things it became. But it's like, you can take tours of the outskirts of Chernobyl and see like the buildings that were just abandoned, and like, schools where, there's still toys on the ground and overturned desks and papers from, people just up and left their lives because they had no choice. It's not just something that was an event and then kind of disappeared into the zeitgeist. It's like reverberated through time because of how big and scary it was.
Yeah. Ryan, what were you going to say?
Well, we always do this. We always sort of like, we have a set list of things, and then we get towards the end, and we try to wrap it up, and then it's like, wait, there's this.
Yeah.
And I was just thinking about that because another big one is Watchmen. It came out in 2009. This is longer ago, but the thing I really respect about Watchmen, first of all, what is that comic book came out in the 80s, and it was about an alternate version of the present. And when they were making the movie, they tried for years to make the movie. And as time moved forward, all the screenplays they had were always, of course, just bumping up the time period. And so by the time Zack Snyder inherited the project, and we all have opinions on Zack Snyder, and I don't think anyone here is in the Zack Snyder loving group. I know James is very critical of him, and I'm not the biggest fan of his Justice League and all that sort of stuff, or his Batman versus Superman. I don't think, Josh, you are either. But I love the hell out of the Watchmen movies.
Me too.
And I think that he did the best version of that story that could be committed to film, just about. But the one decision that he made that I really, really just respect the hell out of him for was he said, no, it's going to be in the 1980s. And that's kind of a little bit of a strange thing to ask an audience to buy. It's one thing to ask an audience to buy an alternate version of the present. It's another thing to ask the audience to buy an alternate version of 20 years ago. And he said that was what he was going to do. Yeah.
The thing about Watchmen is it's a very political story. And I don't think you can tell that story without involving the politics of that era. And part of the impetus of it was that Nixon never left office.
Yep.
Nixon just kept on getting reelected, and the political fallout of that is what is the buildup of that story. That Vietnam never really ended. We're still fighting Vietnam in 1984, and I think because of that, you have to tell it in that era. Sorry,
yeah, it was that Vietnam ended. It did end, and we won Vietnam. That's why Nixon got reelected.
It was because Dr. Manhattan, just basically stopped it.
Right. Sorry. Yes.
But and you're right. And the thing I was going to say that I really respect Snyder for saying was they asked him about it, and he said, "Look, you would never update Moby Dick, so I'm not going to update Watchmen." And I like that. But also that movie is, again, the soundtrack of that movie is really intensely good. Like the way he juxtaposes the music of the time period with whatever is going on. Like the fact that the sound of silence plays during the comedian's funeral, or 99 Luftballon plays when they're on a date. I mean, it's really fun the way he juxtaposed all that.
I mean, put the sound of silence into the zeitgeist for a new generation.
That's true, because
kids these days hadn't heard the sound of silence until Watchmen came out, and now it's ubiquitous in the pop culture.
Other than that, that's all I can really think of that were really like modern day things set in the 80s that were kind of like that kind of like added to the craze of it. You know what I mean? Like, I'm sure we can think of other stuff, but like,
I was going to say 5 minutes after this is done, we'll all think of something that, I should have talked about that.
Yeah. Well,
like,
I mean,
know,
it's funny.
Yeah, go ahead.
Because that 70s show was, I mean, there's stuff that takes place nostalgic for every decade. In the 70s, it was Happy Days for the 50s and American Graffiti for the 60s. Where Were You in 62 was literally the tagline, which was only 11 years ago at the time, which is crazy. But that 70s show was such a big hit, and I love that. I'm a huge fan. But there was a very short-lived show called That 80s Show, which ironically failed. It didn't take off the way that 70s show did at the time. Maybe it would do better today.
Sucked.
It was great. I loved it. I watched it. I loved that show.
It was awful.
Screw you. But yeah, I think there's something about the 80s where, it's a particularly attractive time period.
It makes you also. Oh, go ahead.
There was even a show called I Love the 80s that was on VH1. that was really popular and I really liked. It was a talking head show where everyone just talked about the nostalgia of the 80s, and it was so popular they did I Love the 90s and I Love the 70s, but it started with the 80s. That was the first one.
It makes you wonder how long the 80s craze will go on, because every so often new, like, today's culture, like, they want to revisit a lot of the things. So it makes you wonder when eventually we're going to have a 90s craze, because
I mean, you're already seeing that with a lot of the 90s shows have been coming back over the last decade. And there's a lot of, like, the kids of today are sort of becoming nostalgia for stuff from the 90s, like, Full House and the one that you guys like. I can't. Boy Meets World.
Boy Meets World. The one that you guys like.
That is starting to become part of, like, we're starting to see that shift of the 90s becoming sort of nostalgia culture. I mean, Animaniacs is coming back in a few weeks.
Oh yeah, that's right.
And, like, that was a huge part of the 90s. That was one of the best Saturday morning cartoons in the 90s.
But that's something I was just thinking about, because right now we're still, like, we're slowly creeping into some of the 90s nostalgia, but right now I think the height of 80s nostalgia is still there. You know what I mean?
Well, Nirvana, I've seen a lot of Nirvana shirts now.
It's true.
And nothing defines the 90s more than that, except maybe NSYNC and the boy band craze, which, it's
that'll
like
come in 5 or 10 years.
Oh gosh.
Yeah, it will. Because I think we're talking about 80s nostalgia here, but it's just, we're kind of ending the show now. It just makes you think, because you gotta wonder when that's going to happen, because right now, I mean, the one movie that I can think of that's kind of a love letter to 90s nostalgia is a movie called Mid-90s, directed by Jonah Hill, which came out a couple years ago. A couple years ago. And so it just makes you wonder when we're going to start seeing stuff like that, like shows that are, like, not just revitalizing stuff, but like it's original content that's giving love letters to the 90s.
It's like the song says, time keeps on slipping into the future. I mean, one day, maybe Victoria, your daughter, Josh, will be making a movie all about the 2030s. And she's so nostalgic for her teen years in the 2030s. I mean, that'll happen. It's just that's just the way it's been. But each decade has its own culture.
That's shocking to think about. In the 2030s, she will be a teenager. Holy cow! Wow, that's weird. Well, I think that's a good way to wrap up, folks. Everybody, guys, don't you think that's a good way to wrap up here?
That is.
Because I love the fact that we have these discussions here, and makes you wonder, like I said, what's going to happen in the future. But more importantly, folks, what did you guys think of all the 80s nostalgia that we have talked about here today? What is one of your favorite parts of the 80s that you are very fond of? Maybe whether you're just recently introduced to it or you grew up around it. Leave your comments and let us know your thoughts. Also, guys, if you like what you watch, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel, so you can receive more of our various content in the future. Again, thank you very much for watching. I am Josh Williams.
I'm Ryan Murphy.
I'm James Sheridan.
And thank you for keeping it real.
With ReelTime.
Bye.